I know many of you are big fans of the Berlin variation of the Spanish, so I'm delighted to be able to feature a game with that opening 3 knight f6. Fascinating stuff. So this is game 2 in the match between Nepomniachtchi and Hikaru Nakamura. Nakamura won the first game. Could Nepo hit back? Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe. And do consider supporting us. This is a fascinating game. Naka, well, a game up. Obviously wants to try and play something really solid. You know, he wants to nurse that point advantage. So what would Nepo do? Well, surprisingly, he goes in for the Berlin endgame. Now, you can keep more tension, but he goes into the endgame. And this is very hard for white to prove an advantage in this line, particularly in rapid play. So what's Nepo got up his sleeve? Knight c3, king e8. The king steps out of the d file. It's all well known. Nepo plays with pawn to h3, perhaps looking to advance the kingside pawn majority. h5 is a pretty standard move in this position. Naka goes instead for bishop e6, also been seen before. g4, okay, here we go, it's getting a bit sharper. And knight d4, looking at that bishop, but also preparing to advance the f pawn. The bishop drops back. f4. This is a really sharp line. But it's meant to be okay for black, actually. So far, both players moving instantly. Obviously, both very familiar with this. f5. Pawn takes pawn on g4. Now, if I look at my database, there are 25 games in my database, and all of them have gone h takes g4 and then rook h4. And this is actually okay for black. Black has enough play on the h file. In fact, can get very, very sharp because black can counterattack here. But no games have gone e6. But why not? That's the move that Nepo played. He played it instantly. I mean, if you look at this with an engine, the engine says, actually, it's okay for white. Not as good as simply recapturing on g4, but it thinks it's playable. Bishop g5. Now, why bishop g5? Why can't you just recapture here? Well, then rook h4. And that's serious. But bishop g5 instead from Nepo, played instantly. And here Naka had his first big think of the game. He thought for 5 minutes and 50 seconds, almost 6 minutes on this next move. So he's obviously not familiar with this line. Whereas Nepo clearly was, playing it instantly. Pawn takes pawn on h3. And that's approved by the engine, basically. But at the moment, well, black is 2 pawns up. So this is very interesting gambit line. And now, very interesting, Nepo doesn't want to allow the pawn to h2. Once the king goes to h1, you can imagine the bishop appearing on this diagonal. That could be fatal. So the king steps up to h2. But also not completely secure, because if there's a check on d6, the king will be forced back anyway. So this is really double-edged. And once again, Nepo played that instantly. And Nakamura had a big think here. For a rapid play game where they start with just 15 minutes, he thought for almost 2 minutes here and played knight g6. Machines like b6 here, that's still incredibly tricky. I mean, we would of course like to boot that knight out of the way and take the pawn on e6, but then c5, knight b5, and that spells instant disaster. the knight comes in. In fact, I mean, the king is in desperate trouble, apart from white just winning material. So it's a really tricky position and very difficult if you're not familiar with it. Knight g6 played, which kind of looks logical because this bishop wants to come out to d6 to get some counterplay against the king. Knight e4, again played instantly by Nepo. So clearly he's very familiar with this line. And now it is starting to look really, really difficult for black. Rook h5 played, again after a think of about a minute and a half by Nakamura. Well, this one makes sense because here black wants to play bishop d6 and then that bishop will be threatened. So seems like a decent move, but well, Nepo was ready with his reply instantly. I mean, a tempting move here is rook d1, but then bishop d6 check. And if knight takes, just pawn takes, and then you're threatening the bishop. This is the idea, basically. And black is back in the game. But after this move, rook h5, rook g1, almost instantly from Nepo, guarding that bishop. And this is a really clever move. You might think that white is kind of going on the defensive a little bit. But watch what happens. If bishop d6 check now, we exchange and knight f5. And that's fatal. Threatening a check on g7 and knight d6 as well. And that's just terrible for black. So after rook g1, Naka played a6. Looks like a strange move, but actually what he's trying to do is play c5, drive the knight away, and then take on e6, and he doesn't want to allow knight b5. But another excellent move, rook d1. So just imagine if that knight disappears, then there will be a huge check, well actually checkmate. So for example, c5, knight b5 takes, rook d8 mate. It's over. So after rook d1 with potential to mate on d8, Nepo put the knight back, Nakamura put the knight back on e7. But now a brilliant move from Nepo. He gets it absolutely right. Can you find the move? White to play and win. Here we go. Rook f1. Shuffles over. And this is absolutely deadly. The game finished like this. c5. There really isn't anything better. A desperate attempt to distract white. Rook takes bishop. Boom! That was the final move of the game. Let's see. Here Nakamura resigned. If king takes rook, we take the knight. We take on g7, check. The king comes back, e7 wins, but actually we can play rook f7 check as well. If the king goes to g8, we check. We take the rook, and well, then you can see if pawn takes, then the knight comes back, and rook h7 mates, the so-called Arabian mate. And if the king goes back to e8, knight check, and then e7 mate. Wow. The Berlin completely destroyed. But it suggests to me that Hikaru Nakamura is not kind of up on his theory at the moment, because if he'd been studying diligently, then I'm sure he would have researched e6 in detail, but he wasn't ready for it. And he got badly caught out there. But what a sensational game from Jan Nepomniachtchi. That's absolutely up his street. These kind of tactical attacking games where it's all about flair and initiative. Wonderful stuff. Now, I'm recording this before their match is over, so I don't know what happened in the end, but that leveled the match. But I'll let you know what happened later anyway. Thanks for watching.